Welcome back to Northwest City Politics in the Know with Juanita. We're glad to see you back with us again this week. We're glad that you're watching our show, and we're particularly glad that you are interested in the issues that happen in our cities. If you haven't watched our show before, each week we'll have somebody on from one of the 9 cities in Northwest Community Television's viewing area and be talking about the issues that are happening in that city, so you can kind of keep up to date on what's happening in your city or what's happening in the wider area. And then from time to time, we'll do some special shows like we are tonight. The legislative session got completed not so very long ago, and we're very lucky tonight to have with us Representative Lyndon Carlson.
Well, thank you.
From District 45A, right?
That's correct.
So we're glad to have you with us to kind of fill us in on what happened and how it affects people in our cities.
Well, I'm happy to do that, and maybe I'll footnote something when you say 45A.
Right.
The average citizen doesn't necessarily identify with legislative district
You're
numbers,
correct.
But they identify with communities.
Right.
And so the communities that I currently represent would be parts of Crystal, New Hope, and Plymouth. I don't have all of any one of those cities,
Right.
but I have parts of each, and probably about half of Crystal, I would say probably about 90% of New Hope, and then 3 precincts in Plymouth, which is a very large city of roughly 75,000, but I have about 10,000 constituents in Plymouth, even though I have just a small slice of it.
Right. And you've been on our show before, so you know I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself out to our wider audience. Give them a little background information about you, yourself, and kind of some of the reasons why you continue to serve in the legislature.
Well, there's so many directions that I could go when I talk background, but maybe a good beginning point would be how I got interested in public service. And I grew up in a household where both my mother and father were very interested in current affairs. So the typical dinner table discussion was what was going on in the news, and often that was something that was politically related.
Oh, certainly.
And so I think that's how I developed an interest in 2 ways. One, ultimately in politics, but before I went into politics, when I went off to college, majored in the social sciences and decided I wanted to teach. So I spent most of my time teaching, and I taught for 34 years, teaching government and economics. Once in a while a geography class, so it's a broad social studies major. But that's how I initially got interested in government and politics, was the household I grew up in, and I did have a grandfather that was very interested in politics as well. I remember he was very active in one of the unions, and as a little boy sitting in the living room on the steps up to the upper level of the house, told to be real quiet while they were interviewing a candidate who was running for mayor of Minneapolis at the time. And so I got that introduction as well to what we would now call somebody seeking an endorsement or support from a given group. So as I mentioned, I ended up teaching for many years, and then in 1972, however, and I'd been active in politics before that, I ran for the legislature, and fortunately I was successful.
Right.
So when I mentioned 1972, those people that are a little quick with the math out there would probably figure, well, that's 43 years ago.
Right.
And there are 2 of us now. Representative Phyllis Kahn and I will be the longest serving legislators in the history of the Minnesota House of Representatives.
Pretty good.
Also, that would include the Senate. There are 2 members that, if Phyllis and I are fortunate enough to be reelected to another term, within a few days we would surpass them as well. But their category is that one of them served 2 years as lieutenant governor, which I don't really count as legislative, but they do. And the other, or one of them goes back to like 1909. But a few days into the next, into the 2016 session, we would surpass them as well. But the difference there is that they served sometime in the House and the Senate.
Oh, right.
I don't think that there's a better place, in my view, than to serve a community in an elective office, whether that's a city council, school board, or in my case, the legislature. And you can have an impact on public policy.
Right.
And the other thing is that you also, kind of a part of the job that people don't readily recognize is constituent service.
Oh, definitely.
So you're an ombudsman. You know, somebody has the need for information, in my case, from a state agency.
Right.
Or if I was serving on one of our local city councils, you know, a council person's constituent might call and they need some information about city government.
Sure.
So we all play that kind of a role.
Right.
And that's a part of the serving in office that I truly enjoy, because if somebody's having a problem and you're able to help them solve that problem, you really feel good about it,
Right.
and you feel you've accomplished something. But the general picture, the part that everybody's aware of, is the public service part, the lawmaking, and the ability to have a role in determining
Right.
future public policy.
Right. Now we'll move into talking about the regular legislative session first. And I thought there's been a change. You've been in the majority off and on, but now you are in the minority. What's that like when you're serving, and what the differences that you've noticed?
Well, could I go back to the last question just briefly and
certainly,
mention
definitely.
one more that's been a big issue?
Oh, of course.
Railroad safety.
Oh, yes, we'll
It was a
talk
big
about
issue
that.
locally
Right.
and statewide.
Yeah.
So in terms of what it's like to serve in the minority, you can have an impact, and an important one. It's not quite like being in the majority. I'll give you an example. I was asked by the Dayton administration. I had meetings with the Commissioner of Agriculture and one of the Assistant Commissioners of Department of Natural Resources if I would carry the buffer bill. That was water
okay.
quality, and
Right,
that's where they were
right.
going to have
Yes.
50 feet back from lakes and rivers and
Right,
so on to
right.
prevent, especially in agriculture areas, the runoff
Right.
and the problems that creates for water quality. So I agreed to be the chief author. Well, then the one of the ranking majority members, chair of the committee, said he wanted to be the chief author. So, understanding the role of being in the minority and the committee chair, I became the second author.
Right.
But that's an example, but I still was involved with the issue.
Right,
You know,
right,
it just was a
definitely.
change in terms of whether you're the chief author or second author. And you do have a role in terms of kind of being the loyal opposition. But then a lot of what we deal with is nonpartisan in nature as well.
Definitely.
A lot of bills are not necessarily divided along party lines or majority, minority. In fact, different coalitions sometimes form. You know, on some of the rural issues, you might find rural Democrats and rural Republicans coming together on a given issue. The same would be true of some metropolitan area issues. And then there are, of course, those divisions, and that's where where you're the loyal opposition, and you try to say, well, this is an alternative. This is something you should think about. That maybe we feel would be a better alternative than what you've put before a given committee or the House floor. And sometimes you prevail, and sometimes you don't. But that's the role of being in the minority.
And then one of the questions that I had that I thought we should aim at is, before we go into disagreements, what were some of the issues or areas where there was agreement in the legislature? Focus on the positive.
A very important one that was offered by a minority party member was dealing with the avian flu. You know, the turkeys and the chickens, you know, that were millions of them were dying and had to be put down because of the disease. In fact, we're now seeing the outcome on that with the disease, with the increase in the price of eggs, for example. And I don't know what will happen with the price of turkeys for next Thanksgiving. Some of the farms have now regenerated and have got the disease apparently taken care of. But there was an example of a minority party member brought that forward as an amendment on the House floor. and it passed with a strong bipartisan vote. And there would be other examples. Some of the rail safety issues, we were able to get some bridges. We'll talk about one maybe a little bit later locally, established across the state. Not from our perspective, not nearly as much was done as we had hoped, but that'll be an issue that'll probably be back before us come next March.
Right. And then there was a bit of information in the media, both television and newspapers, in that a number of bills weren't settled until way the last minute. You know, your clock is running out. Why do you think this occurred, or just kind of reflect on it?
Well, there are two issues. That's a common question, even without, as which happened this time, a special session and so on. You get what we call the February forecast, and that comes out either very late in February or early March.
Right.
And that's where the Council of Economic Advisors and the state economist, and then the department, the finance department, as I still call it, or Minnesota Management and Budget, as it's called today, come out with the projections, and they say, under current law, this is how much revenue you're going to have. And that can be up or down. This last time it was up, and up very significantly. So that, in and of itself, means that the budget bills are going to be put together a little later in the session, because that's when you get the numbers that you have to work with.
Sure.
And in addition to that, every legislative session you have new members. And so a lot of the committees are reviewing budgets and getting a lot of background information, so everybody is on a level playing field, so to speak, as they're making decisions. And that's what you're often doing January, February, March. Then on the House side, after you get those projections, then the Ways and Means Committee goes to work very seriously. We would have had some earlier hearings, but that's when we set what we call the targets, and that's the budget number that each finance committee will have to work with. And so all of that takes time. Now, under the best of circumstances, you get done in late May under timely circumstances. This time we had divided government, and we had some disagreement, and the governor ultimately chose to veto some of the bills, and that meant a special session.
Then that rolled over.
So we ran overtime, and so I think that probably gives you a pretty good picture there. But,
but I thought
and in the meantime, you're dealing, however, with a lot of policy bills and so on that don't have fiscal impact before you get those budget numbers.
And then some of the bills that passed during the last regular session was the higher education bill, but maybe you can kind of flesh out what happened, the differences between the 2-year MNSCU and then the 4-year in the U of M funding.
Well, there was a lot of interest on the part of some of us at the beginning of the session that we would continue the tuition freeze. And what we were hopeful of was that that would cover the University of Minnesota as well as the MNSCU system in total. In the end, the tuition freeze was provided for the 2-year institutions, community technical colleges, and there is not a tuition freeze for the U of M or the state universities. And I was disappointed in that. Because cost of attendance has been going up across this nation and in Minnesota as well. And we did give students a bit of a reprieve the last biennium with a 2-year tuition freeze. And some of us would like to give students an opportunity for some catch-up there. But there is a freeze in place for the 2-year, and then the U of M and MNSCU for the state universities are both going to have a tuition increase to generate the revenue they need to operate.
And then one of the things that got accomplished too was more reimbursement for nursing homes.
Yes, that was kind of a two-pronged issue, if you will. Nursing homes generally needed an increase, and if I recall correctly, $150 million was provided. But there was also a discrepancy between metropolitan area, larger cities, received greater reimbursement for a variety of reasons than in some of the smaller communities. The argument years ago was that the wage structures and so on were less in some of the smaller greater Minnesota communities, and so they could provide, hopefully in those days they thought same level of service, but that you would need to attract good, competent employees more in the metro area because of the cost of living being higher. That didn't turn out to be really true. And so part of that was a major adjustment to kind of equalize, if you will, the funding, but virtually all of the nursing homes did receive an increase, but Greater Minnesota did get a greater increase to bring about some equity. And that's a very big issue in Greater Minnesota for a reason that a lot of people don't often think of, but in a lot of those small communities, that's the largest employer. So that's an important service as well as payroll in those communities.
Yeah, that affects the taxes they can collect.
That's right, yeah.
And then we alluded to it before, but in terms of the railroad issue, we've talked about it with the other people on the show. In the area of Crystal, there's a place where the Canadian Pacific Railroad and the
BNSF, Burlington Northern
Santa Fe Railroad could connect their lines, and they were moving ahead without too much publicity to anybody to make a connection that would have severely affected railroad traffic in our local area. Now, maybe you can talk a little bit to the issue, because Hennepin County got involved and then the legislature got involved.
Yeah.
But maybe you can
the important one was Hennepin County. And the railroads are by and large federally regulated, and they have a very strong law dealing with eminent domain where they can take property to meet the needs of the railroad and where they would lay their track and so on. And the story I heard through the city of Crystal primarily initially was that a Crystal business person called and said, gee, the railroad has just approached me to buy my property, and they've got surveyors out here. And what's that all about? And that was the first that the city of Crystal was even aware. Well, if you're a unit of government and you can argue public safety, then you're on basically an equal playing field with the railroads relative to eminent domain. So much to the credit, it was really Hennepin County that did a great job on this. They purchased, I think it was 2 or 3 pieces of property right away, so that they would be at an equal.
In a very short period of time.
It was like they passed the resolution one day and their staff was out making an agreement the next day, and those businesses will continue to operate there. It's just that the county owns the land. So the legislation, it was important to probably pass that, but it tightened up even further a bit the eminent domain law to benefit the county, but the real decision on that was when the county bought that land so quickly. And I have to credit our county commissioners. That really generated a lot of interest. Locally, I worked with our state senator and Mike Freiberg in the other half of the district. And initially we thought, well, because of where the connector was going, we should visit with, to get some input from the cities of Crystal and Robbinsdale, and quickly we found out the way that was going to impact. We had to get New Hope involved. Plymouth got involved, Golden Valley got involved, and then the city of Minneapolis said, by the way, if they start running all of those trains the way they're talking down through the northwest suburbs and then east through Minneapolis, it's going to go right by Target Center in downtown Minneapolis.
Right underneath.
And so it grew in terms of the cities. The Minneapolis Park Board got involved, Metropolitan Council got involved, And so there was a coalition of a lot of local units of government that had an interest. And we ended up having 3 town hall meetings with really a big turnout, and one sponsored by our Congressman Keith Ellison, one sponsored by Senator Rest and Representative Mike Freiberg and myself, and then another one sponsored by the Minneapolis legislative delegation that they had at Theodore Wirth Park because of the Minneapolis interest. They had one down there. So all of the meetings had really a good turnout.
Right. And so now things are settled down, right?
I think we're in good shape with all that happened on that local issue. However, railroad safety remains a major issue across the state, and they need more bridges in certain communities, literally from Fargo-Moorhead area all the way down to Winona, Minnesota, and also better safety devices at crossings and so on to prevent accidents. So there's a lot of interest in major upgrade. I was a co-author of a bill there that was supported by Governor Dayton, where we were going to put a modest tax on what we called rolling stock on the railroads to upgrade those crossings. And that unfortunately didn't make it this last session, but that remains alive, as all bills do, for the next session. So hopefully we can do more with the safety and those crossings, more bridges, and more technology in terms of the arms and the lights and so on when they go down.
Now, we're moving kind of forward in the legislative session. When we got to the end of it, Governor Dayton vetoed 3 major bills where he had some concern about policy issues and some concern about funding. Maybe you can mention what were the 3 bills that got vetoed. Tell us just a little bit about them.
Sure. The vetoed bills were one that's, informally we call it the Jobs Bill. It's economic development. And he was concerned about some of the policy issues there and some of the funding. The Agriculture and Environment Bill he vetoed. The controversy wasn't so much on the agricultural part of it. It's a combined bill, but it was on the environmental side. And a lot of the rules and regulations were being removed that protect the environment, and they also did not have the buffer bill that was Dayton's, at least in the environmental sector, maybe even overall, his number one priority, water quality. And then the education bill that he felt was underfunded. And so now some of those bills had been improved working with the House Republicans and the Senate, but Dayton felt that there still needed to be more improvement on those 3 bills in particular. So that set the stage for a special session. But there were a couple of other things that didn't make it that were taken up in the special session as well. That just didn't make the deadline. One was what we call the legacy bill. That's where there's trails and parks and environmental projects funded there. It's the constitutional amendment that voters passed a few years ago. And that bill didn't make the constitutional deadline for adjournment. And so that was taken up in the special session. That one was not controversial. You asked earlier about bipartisan. That had a very strong bipartisan vote. And then the bonding bill didn't make it. And that was one of the differences that I had personally as the lead minority member or Democrat on Ways and Means. I kept advocating for a bonding bill. And they kept saying, the majority said, no bonding bill this year. And I said, in the end, there's going to be a bonding bill. And sure enough, there was, a small one. But the reason I was so interested in having a bonding bill is that we're still getting good bids on projects, although there was a newspaper article the other day that low bids may be quickly becoming a thing of the past. So I wanted to take advantage of that environment, save the
right.
taxpayers some money on needed projects. And then interest rates are remaining low. And we don't know how long they're going to remain low.
Oh, right, no, we have no
So
idea.
there were a lot of good arguments from my perspective to have a major bonding bill. But in the end, we did have a small bonding bill. And there were a couple of local projects that made it in. I was the chief author for grade separation or bridge. The railroads call it grade separation for Vicksburg Lane. And that was $4.5 million for that that bridge. So being it was a small bonding bill, I was very pleased that we were able to get that in on both the House and Senate side. Senator Rest worked; she was the chief author on that one, and worked hard on that on the Senate side as well. That's part of an 18 to a 20 million overall project. But the city of Plymouth wanted help with the railroad bridge. And then the city of Plymouth is taking care of the rest of the road upgrade. It's a major thoroughfare through Plymouth, but there was
and it's kind of an uneven thing because of the railroad grade and the curve.
A big hump, and cars have to slow down, and if they don't slow down, they go airborne and they go off the road, and it's a real public safety issue. So I was glad that the state was able to help. And then another major issue locally that was in the bonding bill impacts on our school district. And that's the Fair School site. Which it was originally built to provide for voluntary desegregation integration for the western suburbs in the city of Minneapolis. And so they had a separate governing board, and they felt that they no longer needed to be in the business of operating a school site. And the Robbinsdale School District has the need for space, and so they were very interested, because it's located in the Robbinsdale School over on Adair Avenue, and about 40th, if I recall. And so we had that provision transferring the title. So that didn't have a direct cost, but it was originally built at state expense, probably 25 years ago. Last session we did, there was more than one site like that. They dealt with the East Metro, St. Paul's side, last legislative session, and the Purpose School for the Arts acquired that site for an additional arts center. And in this case, when we dealt with West Metro, the transfer was to the Robbinsdale schools to help them address some of their needs. So they were very happy that happened.
Well, I want to thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Upgrading all of us on all the different ins and outs of what happened during the last legislative session. We really appreciate your being on our show and helping us understand. And then we'll ask those of you out there watching to tune in next week for part 2 of the legislative update, the 2015 legislature. We're glad that you've been with us, and we'll look for you next week. Bye.